This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 444, Design to Development Workflow Optimization. On today's show, we're talking about design to development handoff, common complications, and ways to optimize your process with guest Crispin Bailey. We'll also cover office hours as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Crispin Bailey. Crispin is a seasoned web designer, strategist, and accessibility specialist. He actively coordinates design and technical efforts throughout discovery and in key times during implementation to ensure seamless collaboration between research, design, and development. He's been designing websites for nearly 25 years and is a frequent speaker at conferences and camps where he talks about user experience, accessibility, and other web-related topics. And lately, he's been exploring generative AI to better understand its impacts on web design and on our industry. Crispin, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the fourth and final time, Anna Mihailova, Director of Technology at Kalamuna.
Hey everybody, I'm really happy to be here and a little bit sad that it is my last week.
Well, now that you've done this, you get a cool membership card, and you can come back anytime you want to talk about whatever you want. So
that's nice.
We look forward to having you back. And joining me, as per the usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm really excited about the show, and as always, it's as you said, it's a little bittersweet to have the final show with our guest hosts, but as John said, you're always welcome back.
All right. Let's jump into our module of the week. And to do that, we're going to turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to manage and display the hours of operation for a business on your Drupal website? There's a module for that. It's called Office Hours, and it was originally created in January of 2008 by Ozus, though recent releases are by John Vasquilin of the Netherlands. It has 7.x-1.11 and 8.x-1.17 versions available, and it is actively maintained. In fact, its latest release was just 3 weeks ago. It does also have security coverage and test coverage. And as far as documentation, there is no user guide, but it does have a pretty extensive README file. It does have 15 open issues, only one of which is a bug against the current branch, though it's postponed for more info, which is quite impressive considering the module is in use by almost 20,000 sites. Now, longtime listeners may recognize Office Hours as having been previously covered as Module of the Week way back in episode 113, more than 8 years ago in the Drupal 6 End of Life episode. The module provides a specialized widget to set the hours for each weekday with the option to have more than one time slot per day. You can define exceptions, for example, on stat holidays, and you can also define seasons with a start and end date during which the hours are different. The module also offers a variety of options for formatting the output. So you can show days as ranges, for example, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., use 12-hour or 24-hour clocks, and so on. Obviously, we'll also show any exceptions or upcoming seasonal hours, and it can also show an open now or close now indicator. It can also create schema.org compliant markup for opening hours and has integration with the schema.org meta tag module for that. Office Hours does all this with a new field type, so you could add it to stores in a Drupal commerce site, a locations content type in a site for a bricks and mortar chain, or if you just need a single set of hours for the site, you should be able to use it with something like the config pages module. The README file also includes some suggestions on how to use Office Hours with views, which can give you a lot of flexibility on where and how to show the information. So let's talk about Office Hours.
Yeah, this is a bit of a blast from the past. I'm trying to remember. I used this in a project I'm probably the one that suggested it way back when in episode 113,
Well,
because I used it on a project. I need to listen to that and
maybe
remember
it
which
was
one.
you, but it also could have been me because I think I used this back in Drupal 7 for
That's possible.
something and was like, oh, this feels like, or maybe I heard about it on the show and then I used it. But anyway, it's a very I don't know. It's a very niche filling module that does a very specific thing
Yeah.
and does it pretty well.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Martin, in your brief history, you said John Volkswagen of the Netherlands, and I'm wondering if he's the only one. Like, I'm wondering if there's only one, one person with that name in the Netherlands.
I mean, I didn't say the John Voskelen, but
Oh, all right.
he could be. He could be. I don't know.
There is only one Netherlands.
That's true.
Well, that's true, but I don't know. I just felt like it was like kind of like by John Picozzi of Rhode Island, of the Rhode Island. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. I digress. Yeah, this is super interesting. The module also, at least the last time I used it, I'm sure they've probably made great advances since Drupal 7, but the last time I used it, it was really good at just handling those time slots, noting when a place a place wasn't open and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Was really useful. So if I remember correctly, I was using it for a hospital group, and they were basically using it for office hours for their locations. So it allowed for exceptions for like holidays and all sorts of stuff that you might have exceptions for. So pretty useful module.
It's one of those modules that, if you're just doing this for one single site, for one single location, you're probably just going to type it up in HTML, right? But the second you need to allow end users to edit the hours, and they have multiple locations, and you need to enforce rules like holidays and things like that, and you don't want to, risk missing something like that. You just want to set up the rules once. I mean, this module is indispensable for that type of situation. And it's one of those things where it'd be really annoying to write it yourself. So it's wonderful that it's, maintained and contrib and that you can
That's
just
what we did for some of our clients too. Like we just created a block with fields, and like you type your hours in here and you can update as needed. But I would be curious to see if that works well with like schedule or something like that, so that you could potentially schedule publishing. Also, it does recognize the calendar time, so maybe you don't need it, which is great, because the biggest problem was like an editor has to go like midnight and update some like closed or something like that. But if you could pre-schedule some of those, would be fantastic. But it seems like the module is doing something like that with exceptions out of the box, so maybe you don't even need it, which is great. Like I didn't know they existed until I heard today from Martin. So that would be a big improvement for all the future projects that need something like that.
Yeah, it's super helpful.
Yeah, definitely a great module for making things consistent and making things a little bit easier for yourself. As always, Martin, thanks for bringing us another wonderfully enlightening module of the week. If folks wanted to connect with you or suggest a module of the week, how could they go about doing that?
We're always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack. But folks can also reach out to me directly as ManClue on all the Drupal and social platforms.
Great. Thanks a lot. And let's move on to our primary topic. Crispin, admittedly, I don't think any, there's at least one person familiar with design processes on the call, which is good. But wondering, before we kind of jump into the more handoffy workflow optimization aspects of our conversation today, I'm wondering if you can kind of give us an overview of what the primary activities your team is performing as part of their design process.
Yeah, sure. Generally speaking, we have a pretty consistent approach, whether it's a little, feature that we need to design, or a page, or maybe it's a whole website redesign. We always want to start with some sort of a discovery approach where we're doing a little bit of research. We're trying to understand, who are we designing for? What are the problems we're trying to solve, right? So the organization or the owner of the website might be trying to solve a problem for themselves, or perhaps it's a user need that we're looking to address in some way, shape, or form. Or maybe it's a marketing or a communications thing that needs to be thought through. So we want to understand who we're designing for, what are the requirements. So it's really important, and this is where with the collaboration begins right at the beginning. What are the technical requirements or constraints that we need to be aware of before we start getting excited about designing anything? And why are we doing this? What's the strategy behind all this? It's really important for any individual who's trying to solve a problem that they understand the context. Like, why are we doing this? Because maybe someone comes to us and says, we need to do this thing, and there might be several different ways to accomplish the goal. If we don't know what that exact goal is, we might just go down that path because someone said, oh, we need this widget. Okay, great. We'll design this widget. We'll build this widget. We'll ship this widget. But was it really solving the problem that we needed to solve? And that's a fundamental step before we get into things, because it avoids so many problems later if we've designed the wrong thing. We don't want to design and build the wrong thing. So get that level set understanding, make sure we understand those constraints, and then we can get into an ideation kind of mindset, which is very different. It's like, how would we solve this problem? How might we solve this problem? There might be several approaches we can take, but we're going to start narrowing in the options very quickly based on those technical constraints. Might be financial, budgetary constraints. There might be a timeline constraint. So what are all those constraints that we need to factor in? And that'll help us narrow down our path. It could be that the problem's already been solved before, and we're really just picking something off the shelf and maybe doing a little bit of tweaking, making it match the brand, a look and feel, something like that. Or it might be something completely novel and exciting because nobody's ever done it before. And that's when it gets kind of quote unquote fun, but also it can be stressful because, again, depending on what we learned in that discovery phase, we might not have the time, we might not have the budget, we might not have the technical know-how even to pull something off. So then we get into this more collaboration, right, with the developers, with the project managers, with the product owner. Okay, how are we going to do this? And that's all just conceptual at this point, really. We're going to start wireframing, though. We're going to start sketching things out. We're going to start putting things down on paper, if you will, to start visualizing it. And then that's going to help inform those conversations even more. And then things are going to, slowly but surely get more and more refined, and the fidelity is going to increase. And once we're feeling really solid about, the kind of the rough sketch, we, start, and we've had those conversations about, okay, well, how does this part work? And what does this thing do? And what's the behavior going to be when I click on this? Or is this going to be a pull down? Or is this going to be an accordion? Is this going to be a carousel? Once we've figured all that out, that's the mechanics out. Then we can start thinking about, okay, let's make it look really snazzy. Let's apply the fonts. Let's apply the colors. Let's also think about the padding, the corner radiuses, and all those little details that make it feel really nice.
And is that happening? Are you guys using like Figma to do that, or is there some other tool you guys are using?
Figma is our main design tool at our agency. We've landed on that. We actually jumped on that, I should say, when it about 3-4 years ago, maybe, when as soon as it became good enough. And the reason we jumped on it was because this was a game changer in especially for a remote-based agency, because for the first time, designers could collaborate on the same file at the same time. Before that, we were working in programs like Photoshop and Illustrator and saving countless revised versions of files and uploading them to a shared drive space and then downloading those and making adjustments and then re-uploading them, trying to keep track of what was the latest version and who changed what. It was a nightmare. So Figma's a lot, it has been a game changer for us. We do a lot of even early rough kind of sketching and ideation and brainstorming in that space. It's a space we can bring our clients into as well, so that we can, show them things that we're working on in progress and get much more quick feedback. And of course, for the developers as well, that's been really key, because again, it's a lot richer. It's not exactly web native, even though it does use WebGL to render everything you see on the screen. But at least it's let's call it web fluent, because it can provide things like CSS spacing and colors and all that stuff. It's more web friendly.
Yeah.
So we're able to collaborate and discuss things a little bit more easily than we could in the past. Yeah.
So before I move on, I want to kind of call out something that you alluded to, and that is, I think this is less of an issue now, but it usually comes from the development perspective, that when you hear design is just about, like, should it be this blue or that blue? Should it be a circle or a square, right? But one thing that you really highlighted is that design isn't just about how it looks, but it's also about how does it function? What problem does it solve? What's the user experience going to be like? If you don't know, in engineering, is form must meet function, right? So if you don't know what it's supposed to do first, you can't make it look right and you can't make it intuitive. So the design and the discovery side is starting much before that. You're not just saying, okay, let's get the best picture for this. Let's find the best color. Let's look at the brand. You're trying to find out what they're trying to accomplish, what problem they're trying to solve first, which is design.
Yeah. Nick, you nailed it. Design is not a deliverable. It's not the outcome. It's a process. Design is a process. It's all about problem solving, and it's best done collaboratively, because in the old days, and I was guilty of this when I was younger and starting out, that I wanted to be the controller, the master of the design, and I've since realized that's just not how it works, and that's certainly not how it works best.
So when you're working this kind of new, I guess it's not new. I mean, people have been preaching collaboration for a long time, but when you're working in a collaborative aspect, when does the handoff workflow start in a typical project?
Yeah, that's a tricky one to answer. It's not like it kind of starts at the beginning. It shouldn't, ideally, and Anna and I have these conversations a lot, ideally, it's not a handoff. We're hand holding the whole way, ideally. Now, there's going to be times where one person or one team, like the design team, might be holding the baton a little more tightly as they're trying to figure things out. But ideally, the dev team and the dev lead, at least, also has a hand on that baton too, because we need to make those decisions together, especially the impactful ones that are going to result in either a really nice, smooth implementation or a very painful one later on. We want to avoid that, right? We don't want to design things that can't be built easily.
Yeah. And I'm sure when you say hand holding, you mean like it's mutual hand holding, right? It's not like it's not designers hand holding developers, but it goes both ways.
Well, that's funny you say that, John, because sometimes we do benefit from a little bit of hand holding from the developers, right? Especially when there are particular nuances to a platform, right? Because not all of the work we do is going to result in a Drupal website. Some of it might end up in a WordPress website, or it might be a static site or something else. Yep. So having that, but it is about holding hands and doing it together, and merrily walking down that path.
I mean, so other than Talking Drupal, one of my favorite podcasts is Drive to Work, which is by the head designer of Magic the Gathering. And one of the topics of his podcast is the design and development workflow and changes for the game. And I think one of the biggest trends that I've seen because he's been doing it for 25, 30 years or something like that now, is that in the beginning it was very much like, first they developed the cards, then they did the artwork, and then they tried to make them, play well together. And now it's like the further along they get in the timeline, the more blended those teams are. So like in the beginning, when they're doing the ideation phase, they always have a couple of what they call developers on the team to make sure, like, hey, if you do that design, that's good. We can't make that into a workable game state. And it's kind of that's what I'm hearing from you. Like when you're in the discovery phase, you need to have some developers there to be like, hey, that's gonna be really hard technically, or that's gonna and vice versa. Later in the game, when the development team is working on it more, having a designer there to be like, if you put 700 form fields on the page, nobody's going to be able to use it. And kind of rein developers back in as well, and help make sure that you're getting the best product. So it's not about like one team working on it, then another team working on it. It's how do you kind of work together in the same project.
Well, and if it was to be like that, projects would take years longer, right? Because we would have to design everything first before any of the development started, and that's just not realistic. We need to start developing sites before everything's been figured out most of the time. So as soon as we have, like, we focus on like the kind of the macro design elements up front, with the header, the footer, the navigation, how our inner page is going to, support, wayfinding between sections, and like those kind of important universal components and elements, so that the dev team can start with something. And we, prioritize certain, kind of page types or layouts, so that, the implementation team can think through, okay, well, how many content types do we really need? So the information architecture is really an important discussion before we even, start thinking about color and fonts. Those things can be established, and the kind of the foundational blocks can start being built and thought through before we even think about, how big is the logo going to be.
So, Crispin, what are the types of handoff artifacts provided to the team?
Yeah, so there's a handful, I guess. And it starts, like I was just saying, in the information architecture phase. So when we're, thinking through how the content on the site is organized, we'll have a content map, which is, sometimes it's very detailed and defined, and other times it's a little bit loose, but at least we've got a visualization of what the different types of content are on the site and what kind of categorization needs there might be. So that would be one of the earlier ones. You know what? Before that, even our research report, I would say, is also one of those things that we hand off, right? So when we do our discovery, we have a discovery report that we present to our clients, and we say, make sure, are we all on the same page about all these things? This is what we found. This is what we think we're setting it to do, and this is what we all want to build together, right? So I think that would maybe be the first kind of handoff deliverable, but then that information architecture, and then the wireframes. And like I said earlier, that isn't just like a big package or a bundle that we like, here you go, here's your wireframes. Hopefully the developers have been a part of building those wireframes out, right? Because we've been having those conversations. So there's no surprises there. And ultimately what we're working towards, once we do get into the color and the fonts and everything, is, because we work in Figma, we've been working on this for the last, seems like 2 years, a kind of a standardized Figma file that outlines all of the components, all of the elements that a front-end coder would need. And that should hopefully, just layer on top nicely. There shouldn't be any net new features or functionality coming out of that, but at least that file should provide all the guidance around font sizes, spacing, like padding and margins and all that kind of stuff. And there should hopefully also have been some, maybe even a prototype built out that illustrates, like, interactively some of the behaviors that might happen with clicks or hovers, or what happens when you do this, what happens when you do that, how does this carousel work, that sort of thing.
What types of tools are you using for kind of effective collaboration? You know, is it just Figma, or are there other tools that are kind of coming along for the ride that are helpful in that sort of collaboration?
Yeah, it's definitely more than Figma. But working backwards from Figma, there's they have a companion app called FigJam, and it's a lot like Miro. It's kind of like their answer to that. So that is a space where we do a lot of collaboration. We're doing some brainstorming, ideation, and a lot of that kind of the higher level architecting around like the content organization. That's what our content maps are built in. But we also use spreadsheets, lots of Google Sheets to document things and to collaborate in. That's important. And even Google Docs and presentations. But that's less so. I would say the main tools are going to be Figma and FigJam and Google Sheets.
So I want to dig into FigJam a little bit. So it's kind of like Miro, you said. So is there an integration there from FigJam to Figma to be able to kind of say like, hey, here's a wire. Okay, let's bring it into a design and kind of like, pretty it up. Is that kind of the idea?
It's sort of integrated. You can actually copy and paste things from in and out from Figma to FigJam and back and forth. But FigJam is very, very rudimentary. It's like comparing Legos to Mega Blocks. FigJam is the Mega Blocks. Figma is the Legos, right? Where you got the detail, the fine grain control.
I feel like FigJam is really good. The two things it's really good for are like control structures or like a flow chart. Like if you're trying to figure out what the content layout is like, and I don't mean layout like on the page, but like what are the 5 top level pages? What are the sub pages? And you're just trying to like move things around. It's really easy and good for that. And brainstorming, like you said, if you're just you have like a bunch of cards, you're trying to just throw a bunch of ideas up on the board. It's good for that kind of thing too. I'm curious about a little bit of the nitty gritty side of it with Figma, and how you're using it as a tool for communication between the design team, the development team, and the client. Like when you're presenting something or sharing something, are you is all communication going through Figma? Like, are you just using comments? Are you using something else to track feedback, or is there something else that you're using to kind of facilitate that communication and feedback cycle?
Yeah, definitely not just doing that through Figma, because comments and text, while they can be great as an asynchronous method, and they don't have all the nuance, and it's certainly not the best way to have a discussion. So design the design work is nuanced, and a lot of times when we're presenting, whether it's the designers are presenting to the developers on the team or presenting to the client, there are questions within what we're presenting. We're like, we think this might work like this, but let's talk about it a little bit, because it could go one of two ways, and we might be showing some options and alternatives. So that's the key thing, is we don't throw design. I said earlier, designs aren't a deliverable, but I'll use this expression anyways. We don't throw designs over the fence. We don't throw them over the fence to the dev team. We don't throw them over the fence to the clients either. We as much as possible want to present the work, to talk through it, so that we can have that discussion, so we can gauge the responses. A developer might, not say anything, but we can, if we're on a video call together, we might be able to gauge their expression on their face when they see something, and know, oops, this might have to go back to the drawing board. And we can have those conversations and then have the comments afterwards, or keep track of some of the points that are made in that discussion as a comment on Figma. And that's been a lot more helpful. But we also will use a document. Usually with our clients, we will set up a Google Doc, kind of a feedback document that has links to the Figma file, has links to the recording of that presentation and that walkthrough, and has notes from that discussion that we had. And then they can add anything later, because you can't expect people to just have all of the answers, all of the feedback, all the reactions on the fly. That's not fair. We want to give people a chance to think about it, right? Let it settle.
So I actually put this question in just because I was interested more so in how functionality is communicated, right? So to me, Figma doesn't seem like a great tool to communicate how a piece of functionality is supposed to work. And when you were earlier describing, you kind of said that there is some annotation that's happening in Figma to kind of give that insight. So I was wondering, like, do you feel like that's usually enough for the development team, or is there some other document or I don't know, structure set up to kind of to support some of that more finer detail?
Well, annotation is like, it's okay. It's certainly helpful. It's better than nothing. And we could be annotating more probably. And I've been trying to encourage the team to do more annotation,
Right.
especially to layer on guidance around, what semantic like heading level are we at here with this block and the heading this block, or what are some of the accessibility considerations, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the tab order and things like that. We want to be doing more of that. But what Figma can do, it's time, budget, and effort permitting, is we can prototype quite a bit in terms of that functionality. And with last summer's release of tokens and variables into the mix, it is technically possible. You can build a calculator with Figma now and prototype that and have like almost a realistic, like a very realistic e-commerce experience where you can have a cart where you can, click on the buttons and see the count increasing and calculating your price and doing all that stuff. I don't think that necessarily makes a lot of sense when it might be quicker to do that in code. And so we generally seem to have to practice, just enough design, just enough to have that conversation with the developers so that they have enough of a sense that they can, start building something. And then we can, the conversation is not done, right? Because this, like I was saying earlier, it's a process. And until it's shipped, we're all working on this thing together.
Yeah, it's iterative, right?
It has to be. And very oftentimes we don't have the luxury or the budget to wireframe every single page we're going to do or every single block. And there are going to be some aspects of the site that, we'll say, okay, what would Drupal do? How do you want take the first crack at building this feature or this, building out this page. And then when you get to a spot where you're ready to have a conversation, let's get back together and talk through what changes or improvements we might want to make.
Makes sense.
Crispin, tools for design constantly evolving. How do you evaluate new tools and pipelines? Is it you're trying it on new project, on long-term projects, on something else?
Well, I generally don't try new tools on client projects. Rule number one, because that's risky. And I learned those lessons earlier on. We can't accurately predict how much time it might take to learn that new tool, what its limits are. So we typically will do some internal experimentation. If there's any opportunity on an internal project, or just even some playing around, like a prototype, a concept, we'll generally do it that way first. And that was the case with Figma. When it first came out, we were evaluating it. We're like, okay, well, let's try this on our own website. Let's, if we were to redesign calamina.com with this tool, let's see how that'll work. And that still holds true today. And as we might talk a little bit about, some of these generative AI tools that are coming out. Those are things that we need to understand them without the risk of impacting a client project. Because the reality is we're being paid to do what we know how to do really well. And unless there's full transparency and disclosure about that experimentation, then it's not appropriate. So I like to, block off a bit of time every week to just do a little bit of experimentation and see if something's, worth even bringing up with the rest of the team. And then we have monthly demos, design demos, where we share things that we've kind of run across over the past few weeks. Hey, look at this cool thing. I was playing around with it. It can do this really well. And then we'll kind of, socialize it with the team that way. And that seems to be going pretty well, because then other people are like, oh, okay, I can see how that might work in this use case or that use case. And then we'll adopt it if it's worth it.
Is there a process there though? You said like you would never try a new tool on a new project or project, an existing project. Is there some sort of, I don't know, new tool onboarding process to a project once you've kind of vetted it internally to say, hey, we're going to start using this? Or is it more just, getting that internal buy-in, and then as new projects come along, you start integrating some of these newer tools?
Well, I mean, there aren't that many tools coming out that we need to integrate too frequently. So it's not like anything that's keeping me up at night. Usually it's like maybe a little plugin for Figma. There are some cool little plugins, and those are generally going to be safe. It's like, okay, we can get a CSS color generator, or some little bitmap to vector tool. Those things, it's not a big deal to incorporate. Like when we moved to Figma, that was a bigger deal. That was like a big deal. As we're going to start looking to incorporate some generative AI tools, we realized before we can do that, there are a lot of things we have to put in place. We have to do our due diligence. We have to think about, privacy and data policies and all sorts of stuff. So we've started a full-on AI governance program at our agency, and we're just at the point right now where we're evaluating and prioritizing our use cases, and we're going to have a proper program to test those tools before we implement them into the practice fully. So it's like little task force testing these things out, looking at the return on investment. Does it make sense for us as a business to adopt these tools? Because they might be shiny, blingy things, but we already know how to design websites. If something can help us do that better, great. It's on us to explore that. But until things, until we start designing for, I don't know, like the spatial stuff for Apple Vision Pro, which we're not doing today, it's usually little things. And we can safely experiment on those on the side and then incorporate them if it makes sense.
I think that makes sense, but I was also wondering about certain things like that maybe lean a little bit more on the front end developer or the developer side, but tools like things that become standard over time. So, for example, Storybook, right? Or Pattern Lab. Like Pattern Lab used to be the way that you presented style guides and things to clients. I consider it a design tool as a backend developer. Maybe you don't consider that a design tool, but once Storybook came out and I started using that in new projects, every time I had to work on an older Pattern Lab project, it was painful. It was, it was a little bit out of date. I had to remember how things were. I had to remember the syntax. Do you have, so my question is around those types of things. Like, do you have a way to like slowly upgrade, or maybe even like smaller modular things, like, as different CSS rules start to become more available, like now container queries work and exists. Like if you're working on a long-term project, do you start incorporating newer CSS technology in the designs and functionality, or do you just kind of like, well, this project was built in 2022 and didn't exist then, so we just don't use it? But like, I guess that's one thing I'm curious about as you're talking about longer-term projects. How do you keep those workflows up to date? Or is it just whenever you have to have a new project with them to kind of rebuild and then you modernize them at that point?
Great question. So I want to wind back to the Pattern Lab and Storybook thing, because for a designer, those are more like deliverables. Right, because that's like, okay, that's where all the thinking has culminated into this design system that's encapsulated in this product, essentially. And it's not the website but it's like one step removed from that, but it is a website. It's on the web. It's got all the colors, all the features. It's just organized a little differently. It's kind of like putting all the ingredients for the cake like out on the table, so you can, in a nice organized way. And that is something I'm really interested in, and I've also been a little bit frustrated by, because we, as an agency, we rarely have the long-term product iterative life cycle to work on. Most of our projects, like we ship the web design and we might support it, but it's not the same thing as like if we were working at a product company that had a online SaaS kind of thing, and we needed to maintain consistency month after month, feature after feature, as the product family grows. That's the perfect case for having, the storybook set up or having that design system encapsulated. So that's, Anna and I talk about those things all the time, and we're trying to get closer to that, but it's almost like it would almost be a waste of time to do that. We developed internally our own platform called Calistatic, which does that. It has a CSS, HTML, JavaScript style guide with full navigation. You can go through all the components and see all the code and all the markup for all the different atoms, molecules, organisms, etc. And you can prototype pages and blah blah blah. But it's generally outside the purview of most of the projects, because there's a lot more overhead and investment that has to go into that. And websites that are, going to be used by a smaller department or a nonprofit, they just don't have the money to make that investment. And then, frankly, it's not going to give them a return on their investment, because they're more likely to just redesign their site completely in 3 to 5 years, anyways, or 5 to 10 years in some cases, right? And by that point, it would be obsolete.
So, Anna, I'm actually curious about your opinion on this question too, because it certainly has implications on your side of the coin as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and the answer is it depends, classic answer. But really, it depends on budget and on the client, right? We definitely not opposed to, like, let's say if we had a very old website with, floats, and I wouldn't tell the developers not to use Flexbox suddenly on that. That would be, very challenging for them. So we are not opposed to incorporating new CSS technologies that are coming in as they go. We are not opposed to upgrading from, let's say, legacy jQuery to JavaScript. We're trying to connect these milestones to upgrades of Drupal usually. So like if there is a refresh from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, we would go and update the theme into a new technology. But over time, we also made an executive decision to make the themes very lean. By very lean, I mean it's we very rarely using a contrib-based theme or starter kit nowadays, because again, that is unpredictable how it's going to be maintained. So unless the client has a requirement of like, we want a bootstrap, and they have internal department that uses bootstrap, we will not use that. We have our starter theme, which is very lean, not only on CSS and stuff, but it's like our philosophy is close to vanilla technologies as possible. So if it's JavaScript, it's going to be vanilla JavaScript, not other libraries, unless those libraries are significantly beneficial. Even our Calistatic, Crispin, our new version is actually very close to Drupal core. It's just tweak CSS and vanilla JavaScript. There is no secret sauce, so hopefully it will extend the lifespan of that product. And it also integrates very easily. So we are trying to make sure that you are not managing integrations that can become legacy. That's difficult. For the same reason, we are not using Webpack. I know everybody will be shocked right now. Why are you not using Webpack or something? We are using NPM scripts. And the reason we do that, again, for ease of upgrades and maintainability. And we have a process in the company that upgrades our default theme as new versions of Node come along. So somebody on rotation pick up this task and internally upgrade the theme. We test it out, usually on our fantasticcalamuno.com again, not to tax the clients with that. And then we roll out that same upgrade to all the clients and upgrade our CI/CD pipelines, because we compile the same eyes-on CI/CD or for clients that are on hostings that support Node on the hosting itself during the deployment artifact. So Node and packages we consistently upgrading. We found it was very challenging trying to do it when we're using a package manager like Webpack or something like that, because that created more overhead and harder to kind of manage all the dependencies. So we minimized all of that as well. We use storybooks. We used to use those style guides. We are trying to decouple them now. So if the client is wanting to use that, we found that the clients don't benefit from them after the site has been live, because nobody has a budget to support it, right? You add new components and other things, that's usually an overhead. In support budget, they have less resources to be able to update it. And frankly, editors often forget they have a style guide. So we prefer having in Drupal style guides. They were like, we could put components on pages and show them good use of the components for editors. We have inline style guides that outlines all of our styles in CK editor to show people how the hierarchy of typography and everything else goes. That minimizes the overhead. Over time, it's not going to be broken. Also, those pages are possible to be automated to test for accessibility. So it kind of like made sure it's easy on us. To answer your question, Nick, we do keep it up to date, but we minimize the dependencies we have to keep up to date.
Let's shift from talking about the process and kind of how the work gets done, how the work gets communicated, and talking more about common challenges, right? So we all know, we've all been part of projects where there have been challenges between the designers and the developers that are working together. So first of all, I'm wondering, what are some common challenges that that you guys see between designers and developers, and then how we go about kind of negotiating those conflicts or coming to a air quotes peaceful resolution, if you will.
So where those conflicts happen 99% of the time is it's in the kind of the visual design phase of the process. And the reason for that is because historically, UI designers, which I'll put in a slightly different camp than the UX designers. A lot of the designers on our team do both, but will have different strengths. And the ones that come from more of a UI design stream, it's almost like when we used to, maybe this still happens, but when we used to work with people who started in print, they came from print design and came to web, where they were used to designing everything right down to the fraction of a millimeter. And then they brought that attitude over to the web and demanded pixel perfect implementation of their work, right? Of their vision. And there's less of that than there used to be, but it still happens where some designers may not be as familiar with some of the, I wouldn't say they're limitations, but let's call them constraints of the implementation based on the front end theme, based on the structure behind that theme. And so they don't know how impactful it can be to move that little block, a couple inches to the right. Or they want it to be lined up perfectly with this thing at all breakpoints, which they don't even really have a notion of what a breakpoint is. They just expect it to always be perfect. And we have to have those conversations like, no, can we please have that, on this line and not on the same line for these reasons? So that's where Anna's team will, provide us that feedback and say, okay, this is going to be really hard for us to do this like this. And here are the reasons. And we hear, and for accessibility, there's some other considerations that we need to take into account. So we try to level up our designers as quickly as possible. But when a new person joins the team, there's usually one or two projects where there's more friction until it's not that they're beaten down, but it's more like they're educated and become a little bit more knowledgeable and aware that they have to ask those questions, and they have to go through the process open to change. And that's really a mindset shift that a lot of designers who have this control freak tendency need to let go of. You cannot be a control freak.
It's less about like just throwing it over the wall or just saying, hey, build it the way it's like it's presented, like, right? And more about, you know, how can it be built, or how, you know, how is it best going to benefit the user, right?
Well, then the client has to be taught that too, though. See, that's the other challenge, right? Because even if the designer's like, okay, we'll move it, but the client was like, I approved this mock-up, right? You showed me this is what I want. And we're like, okay, but this is the reality. So now we have to be really careful that we contextualize all that up front. And so we're constantly kind of re-educating throughout the process and reminding our clients, okay, this is subject to change, but this is what we're trying to go for. This is a direction, not the final result. Once it's built, that is going to be what it looks like. That is going to be your final result.
I find that print isn't the issue so much anymore as the age-old issue of the CEO has a 95-inch monitor in their office, and then they have some sort of specific phone, and you need to resolve those two very specific resolutions. But my question is, I have a very specific question, because this is something I struggled with. You know, a lot of the people I work with are similar to Kalamuna, it sounds like, as far as philosophy, right? It's collaborative between design and development. We try to educate on both sides, right? I'll be the first to admit I am not a designer, and there's a lot that designers can teach me, and I try to understand, you know, what the problems they're trying to solve as well, because as you know, we're all on the same team. But one thing that I struggled with for a fair bit is both understanding and explaining and collaborating with designers, front-end developers, and, you know, myself as Clamp, like, because like when you're describing that, like, it used to be like you would have breakpoints and like it might not be exact, but with Clamp, like, you'd have preferred values, but I feel like it separates like what the actual gap is or spaces or sizes even more conceptually. Like, how do you approach new concepts like that, where it's like, well, hey, if you can have a maximum, you can have a minimum, you can have a preferred, but at any given point, you're not going to have fine-tuned control without overrides. You're not going to have fine-tuned control of exactly what it's going to represent on the page. Like, how do you start to integrate those types of things into the design process?
Well, slowly. We haven't. In the case of Clamp, I'm scratching my head like, Clamp, what's he talking about? Now I got something to look up after the show.
So Clamp is used to, I mean, it's used a lot with fonts, but it's also used with spacing and stuff. It's like, this isn't going to be the best explanation, because like I said, I've been struggling with this, but you can provide a minimum size, a maximum size, and a preferred size. So for example, with a font, you can be like, hey, no matter what, this font in this place can't be smaller than 1 rem.
Right.
No matter what, it can't be larger than 2 rem or 4 rem. But by default, we want it to be 2 rem, and it will try to fit it in the space, and it will fluidly change size depending on what the browser thinks is the optimum size. But what that means is when you're looking at it, you're like, well, we've put those Clamp settings in, and like, well, what size is it? It's like, well, it happens to be 3.175 right now, because
right. Okay, so we've done this. We have done this, and it's actually really exciting to be able to do this now. And I got really excited about variable fonts several years ago for that reason, because all of a sudden there was more mutability to typography, right? It was not just a fixed size and a fixed width and a fixed line height. It was flexible and fluid depending on the size and shape of the screen. And so those capabilities that exist, we have to discuss with the front end developers early on to make sure that what we're designing is going to be can be realized in the browser, and like, how is that going to work in the theme setting. But we've done some sites with variable font sizes, So it shouldn't matter what's the actual font size is, as long as there is, like you said, there are minimums that we're trying to maintain for legibility and for accessibility. But browsers should be able to adjust for that anyways, right? We still have WCAG guidelines to meet, and the end user needs to be able to adjust the font size to their needs without it breaking the layout and becoming unintelligible and illegible. So it's, again, more collaboration, more discussion. And sometimes it's like, hey, on this project, can we do this thing? Can we do dark mode on the site, have light and dark mode? And because that opens up a whole can of worms, and everybody's got to be in agreement. Okay, we're going to open the can of worms for this project, and we're going to do it. But here's what it's going to result in. We're going to have to think all this stuff through beforehand. It's not something anybody wants to have sprung on them at the end, especially not our front end developers.
Yeah, and you can't truly know the challenges until you do that. But this is the piece that always fascinates me, is how you keep up to date.
Well, and Figma is starting to incorporate a bit of that too, with where you can have flexible components and you can set a minimum and a maximum width. And you can even set wrapping properties. So it's getting a little bit closer and making it a little bit easier to have those conversations slowly.
And I mean,
we usually allow front-end developers drive the fluidness. Basically, we have end result for mobile screen, and we have a result for desktop. And usually, as you mentioned, Nick, widescreen. That became a requirement because, yes, that CEO problem with 95 inches monitor is real. But other than that, we rely on front-end developers to do what the browser does best, and then review it by designers versus vice versa. Basically, we explain them to designers, this is how it flows, or this is how it's going to stack. And then designers can advise of can you move it over here or over there. The biggest challenge we have on your note that you mentioned, Nick, is Figma and how it renders fonts versus web fonts. Sometimes we have the same font in Figma and the same font in web, and they render completely differently in terms of boldness or how thin it is. This is sometimes, it creates a problem not between design and developer team, because we can communicate and explain this is how browser renders it, but between clients and us, because sometimes they see this mock-up, a perfect prototype they saw from Figma, and they look at the website and it's like, the font is bolder, and it's like, there is nothing I can really do about it. This is just how the browser renders the web font versus Figma render engine. This is the biggest challenge, and I don't know how to solve it yet.
It's communication, I think. It's the same thing, but it's a lot tougher, I think, when it's a client conversation sometimes. I'm curious, Crispin, how do you handle workflow optimization? Because if we think about this as, an iterative cycle, I imagine it's not this, but is it once per project at the end, you're like, okay, how'd the handoff go on this project? What can we do to improve it? Or are you kind of just across projects every so often, kind of just auditing the process and saying okay, what are the pain points for our teams? What are things that we can do to improve communication? What are things that we can do to improve efficiency? How is the optimization cycle for this type of process?
It's not one thing, it's several approaches. So, and as you mentioned, we do retrospectives, usually at the end of projects, but on a longer project, there'll be more intervals where we'll do that, have that little bit of reflection, and so we don't lose those lessons or forget about them. But more on the regular, we have a weekly check-in between the designers and the front-end developers to surface challenges that have come up that week or that are pressing, but also to move some of these initiatives forward in the collaboration spaces. Like I alluded to earlier in the call, we've been working on our Figma kind of final deliverable. We're calling it a design system, but a design system is actually the code as well, right? Design system is the whole kit and caboodle. But on the Figma side of it, we're trying to come to a point where it's like the ideal deliverable for the dev team, because they can just go to one page, see all the components, see all the layouts, all the mock-ups. Things have been marked ready for dev, and everything's been annotated just right. That's the dream. That's what we're going for. So we have ongoing check-ins, and then ad hoc meetings to try and move some of those initiatives forward, because it's not like a one and done thing. The tools are changing, the industry's changing, the client expectations and our own goals are changing. So we want to keep on top of all that. And the only way to do it is if we keep meeting about it and communicating where we're at. And as an agency, it's on us to be at the forefront, or as close to it as we can safely be, for our clients, so that we're delivering the best possible products. Right? It's a very competitive world out there, and if we fall asleep at the wheel, we're not going to be getting the good projects. So we do have that hunger to stay on top of things and push things forward and try to do things better every chance we get.
I'd be curious to know more about that perfect deliverable like end state, because you just reminded me of one of the worst parts of one of the best projects I ever worked on. It was a very, I mean, it's still an ongoing project, but it was a very, very large design system. There's something like 250 components at this point. It's large, but it's a very large organization. They have thousands of websites, so it's warranted. It's not just a case of inflation. But we found out pretty early on that Figma it's a large limit, but it has a limit to how much you can put into one space. And so we ended up with an index Figma that would just be like, okay, if you're looking for this component, go to it. And it was like my life for like a month and a half was like, okay, is this workspace 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Just trying to figure out where a particular component was. And it was, that was one of those, like, we hit that wall and we had to meet and really quickly come up with a solution on how, because the designers had to move forward with designing new stuff and developers needed to be able to find it, but we couldn't really stop the project where it was. It was too late in that process. So I don't think that perfect end state would probably work in that particular project, but a lot of my clients use Figma, and I'd be interested to know, if there's a blog post or something now or in the future for that. I'd love to see that. But yeah, you just gave me flashbacks to hunting around for the specific information in Figma that I needed at the moment, and having like my computer like grinding to a halt because I had so many Figma windows open trying to find the one. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But so it sounds like you have regular check-ins as well as scheduled check-ins for improving communication.
Yeah, and it really benefits the team as a whole, because one project may surface a challenge, and then everybody gets to learn about that challenge, so that we're not, struggling with it later, 3 months later on another project. So socializing and sharing those learnings is really important, and solving those problems together rather than, in isolation.
Are there any steps that can be taken by development team prior to final design deliverable handoff?
Well, just come to our demos, ask the questions, don't be shy, speak up, because there's, like we said earlier, there's no final deliverable, right? It's going to be chunked out regardless. But I think developers can, help the most by thinking big picture, and try, the same way developers hope that designers will think like developers. It's really helpful if developers think like designers too. It's a mindset shift, and sometimes designers can think too much like a developer, and it prevents them from opening their minds a little bit to the possibilities. But it's the same thing happens on the dev side, where developers might just be used to doing things a certain way. It's a mindset shift, like, well, how else could I do this? And that's not about being a developer or a designer. It's about being an open-minded individual when we're in that ideation phase, or when we're in that space of evaluating the possibilities and the technical, like, how are we going to build this thing, right? We all have to kind of break that I know how to do things mentality to be like, well, how could I do things differently in this case, because we're trying to do something different here.
So in that vein, right, do you share wireframes with the development team earlier on so that they can start doing some of that thinking? Because it's, we all want to work agile where, you know, both teams are kind of moving towards the end goal at the same time, right? And it's a little bit hard sometimes to do that when you're not clear as to what the vision is. So do you share wireframes or some sort of pre-thinking with the development team so that they can kind of investigate some of those things early on?
Yes, but we could do that more. I think the best examples and when it works at the best is when we have these sketching workshops that we do on some projects where we have a challenge. We're going to look at this homepage. We're going to look at the specific, functional page, and we have everyone in the core project team. So designers, developers, client, producing sketches, essentially early stage conceptual wireframes. And then we bring those together and talk through what everybody's kind of conceived of, like walking through each person's vision for how that could work. Though when we do that, we have much more success in, first of all, establishing common understanding of the different ways, what problem we're trying to solve and how we might want to solve it. But we're getting different perspectives on what challenges there might be with designing and building this thing that we're trying to do. And otherwise, it's hard sometimes for us to find the time in our calendars, juggling all the different projects, to meet more frequently. But our design leads will share wireframes sometimes when they're just like, maybe I'm not sure about this. Can you just take a quick look at this before I keep going? And we try to encourage that because that really helps. Otherwise, it doesn't happen until we have like an internal dev review, which is like a required step before the client sees anything. So the answer, John, is yes, but we'd like to do that even more.
Right, that makes sense. So let's talk more about frameworks. Like, are you guys using any frameworks or any, special processes to kind of help the handoff, to kind of help the process along?
Well, I guess that's something that we're always trying to do and do better at. Like we were talking earlier about, the storybooks and the pattern labs, which is kind of like almost like an endpoint for the design work. But we're looking at other design leaders in the industry and how they're articulating the outputs of the design process. So looking at, material design or IBM's carbon system, and looking at, how other large organizations are documenting the design components and elements and the system behind it and the thinking behind it. And we're trying to incorporate that into an agency model, which is admittedly really challenging because it's almost like by the time we've done the design work on one project, we're off to something completely different. And documentation is often like a scramble to make sure, like I was saying, just enough designers, also just enough documentation so that the developers have what they need. And sometimes we get pulled back, like, oh, wait, yeah, I know you're working on those 3 other projects, but we have a question for this one you were working on 2 months ago that it's finally gotten to that point where we're building this piece. Do you remember what the intention was for this? I'm like, oh, shoot. So we're learning as those things come up, how important it is to document along the way, because sometimes we don't remember. It's like, oh shit, I got to rethink what was the thinking here. Does anybody have notes about that? Does anybody remember why we did it this way instead of that way? So that's why documentation is important, and I'm trying to emphasize that to the team, like annotate. Just put a comment on there. It doesn't have to, explain everything, but even to remind yourself later why we did it this way and not that way.
That's true of development too, right? You're commenting not just for somebody else. You're more often commenting for yourself a week from now when you have no idea what you were doing. I related to this. I have one question, and I'm going to ask you to try to keep it brief because I want to leave a little bit of time for the last question of today's show. I'm pretty excited about. Speaking of this, how do you ensure the final quality of the designs after they've been implemented? Like once you've done the handoff, once Anna and her team have in the front end developers have implemented it, you're doing that final pass. How do you make sure that the vision is what is implemented? How do you do, I guess, the QA on the implementation?
Well, we call it design QA. And it's something that we have to, negotiate for the time and the access to the project. So it's hard because sometimes the project, we can't really leave it till the very end when it's all ready, because at that point, the client's, banging on the door saying, "Where's my website?" So we try to incorporate that along the way if we can. So ideally, it's happening in kind of lockstep as pieces of the puzzle are being, finished.
Yep.
But more typically, it's like, okay, we've got this 1 week to go through everything, document as much that needs to be fixed as possible, have those conversations, and then build like a little bit of a backlog of things that, need to be polished or tweaked or adjusted. Hopefully there's not a ton of things to do, but it really depends on how that project went for all kinds of reasons, whether it was, there was a timeline crunch or whether there was some budgetary concerns. So we had to limit how much effort went into a certain thing. So that design QA, that can't really be done in isolation either. There's more conversation happening there ideally, where the designer's documenting a bunch of things, then reviewing it with the developers and saying, well, what about this? What can we do there? Is this what, and with the project manager as well, so that they understand, well, what are the ramifications of moving that block, 2 inches over? Is that going to be, 15 minutes, or is that going to be 5 hours or 15 hours? So we have to, be responsible, be grown-ups, and think about, well, what's in the best interest of the client and the project, and can we fix that later? And let's not forget about it. That's, as a designer, we do have a little bit of an attachment to seeing things, come out the way we all agreed that it would be ideal if it could. But we also have to understand that, some things might need to get fixed a little bit later on, because we have to get this website out. That's more important at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What about AI? The final and the most exciting project, the question of the day is, what about AI? Have you done any projects with AI yet, incorporated into your processes, or played with any tools that you see potential for us to use in the future?
Yes, cautiously. We've started using some tools where it is, first of all, safe, where there's no data or confidentiality risks. So we're not putting any client information into an AI engine that we have no control over. But for things like, we just need like the other day, I needed an icon of a tow truck. I'm like, okay, well, I've got this little plugin for Figma. It's called Magician. And it's got this little tool, and I can generate some icons using a text prompt. And it gave me 3 things that did not look like tow trucks, but one thing that was close enough to a tow truck. I'm like, okay, that's great. I'll take that one. And it created a little vector icon for me. And that was great, because that saved me, probably an hour or 2 of work, either looking for a tow truck icon somewhere on the web or designing one from scratch. But as far as some of the bigger tools, like generate a website by putting in your text prompt, design me my website in 20 seconds. We're seeing these tools start to emerge, and we're looking at them a little bit side-eyed, like, I'm not sure. We'll check those out because we need to know, but I do not trust this to come up with anything great. ChatGPT, has their DALL-E, and we've used that to show me what an interface, a homepage for a certain kind of website. And it's mostly garbage. You can't really use it for anything. And a lot of these tools are at that stage where it's really experimental. So we are taking this in stride. It's like, okay, we need to know where the tools are at now. We need to understand where these tools are going. This is going to affect our entire industry. So let's not lose sight of the arc that all this is on. So as I mentioned earlier, we're starting to do document use cases right now. We're going to be exploring tools over the next couple months. There's going to be training and education required, and not just like how to use these tools, but what are the implications of using these tools? What are some of the ethical considerations? Not just about like, is somebody losing their job because we're using this tool instead, but like, where did the data come from? Where did this model, what data did this model train on? And is that okay? Or do we need to consider, a private model for this application? It's really complex. There's a lot of layers to it. So generative AI can be very helpful at brainstorming and ideating and getting some stuff out on the page when you're stuck, but don't expect it to be the product. You're going to still need to do the work. You might get a good rough draft that you can then throw out and redo yourself later, but do a better job. And remember that it's basically making shit up. And it's going to be even more on us as practitioners to be very critical about what it generates and be very professional about how we take that and keep the bar high. I mean, we're craftspeople, all of us. We have standards that we aspire to. These tools are like juniors. They're like little toddlers compared to the knowledge that we have as humans and all the complexities that we're taking into consideration as part of our practice. So that's our approach right now. Proceed with caution, but by all means, see what it can do and have some fun. I'm having a lot of fun generating images of like birds in the jungle and like just having fun. It's like a really great tool. My partner and I made a song the other night. We had using a music song generating tool, and it was you would not press this to vinyl. You do not put this out on the web because the quality was so low, but it was fun. So there's that side of it, and I think it's going to be very interesting times. I foresee in the future, designers are not going to be just designing for screens. We're going to be designing for endpoints, and I think the fundamentals of information architecture and semantic data structure are going to become even more important for designers to understand and think through, because we're going to be designing for APIs as much as for screens.
Yeah, I think you're right on the generative AI as a starting point that you can then kind of craft into your own. On that note, Crispin, it's been wonderful having you and a very enlightening conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
And get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. And to sign up for the newsletter, you can go to talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Okay, we've reached that point in our show where we ask our guests for their contact information. So, Crispin, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how could they best go about doing that?
Reach out to me through our website, calamina.com. You can also find me at LinkedIn. And I'm also over on Blue Sky, the new social media app.
Very cool. I think you may or may not be our first Blue Sky user, but from what I hear, it's going to be all the rage. Anna, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how might they go about doing that?
The best space would be Drupal Slack. I'm there at the handle A Mikhailova. You can also reach out to me through Drupal.org. My contact form is open, the same handler as in Drupal Slack. And you can always find me at calamuna.com website as well.
Amazing. And thank you again for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It's really been a pleasure. All right, Nick, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how might they do that?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at NixFan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can also find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you enjoyed listening, we enjoyed talking.
Have a good one, everyone.